Привit moi druzy. Hello, my friends. My name is Darren Gerdes. I'm a professor trying to help you understand what's going on in the war in Ukraine. I'm trying to provide you context. I wanted to talk about President Xi of China and what China's role may be as we move forward. So I want to start with this. This is a tweet by Zelensky talking about his meeting with President Xi. He said, "I had a long and meaningful phone call with President Xi. I believe that this call, as well as the appointment of Ukraine's ambassador to China, will give a powerful impetus to the development of our bilateral relations." Well, let's look at the background of this and how we got to this place, and then we're going to also talk about 10 potential places that China may be. Like what's the G scale? They could do this or they could do this. And it could really upset the world order if they do one thing, and it could really bring a lot of peace if they do others. Okay, so let's look at a couple background articles to see how we got here. So first, there's this article of Xi Zelensky call may have been prompted by ambassador's undiplomatic comments. So this guy, his name is Ambassador Liu She, caused outrage across Europe this week when he denied the sovereignty of former Soviet states, saying that they did not have effective status. That is, former Soviet states, this is what he's saying, former Soviet states are not actually their own nations, and it caused some significant controversy when he made this statement. Here's an article in DW. China must position itself over Ukraine, says the Lithuanian president. So it's no secret that Lithuania has been all in Ukraine's corner from the very start, and that's because they understand what it was like to be dominated by the Soviets. The Lithuanian president cast doubt on China's credibility as a mediator in Ukraine in an exclusive interview. Well, there's a reason. There's some bad blood between the two. Beijing has seen strained relations with Vilnius since November 2021, when Lithuania allowed Taiwan to open a de facto embassy in the country. So I kind of give it to the Baltic states, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia. These guys are like they're really plucky, and they're willing to stand up to tyranny. Even though they're these tiny little countries in the region, they're still like, no, we're not going to let this happen. And so they're sticking up for Taiwan in the process. Now, there's some significant background here because the war in Ukraine, Zelensky always talks about how the war in Ukraine is really a war for the rest of the world. It's really significant, and I think he's spot on, because what's happening in Ukraine has been informing Xi about what he might not want to do that he otherwise might have done. So we'll talk about that in just a moment. Here's another article. It's in Politico. Xi tells Zelensky China won't add fuel to the fire in Ukraine. And so here I just want to read a couple things. Beijing would not add fuel to the fire of the war in Ukraine and insisted time was ripe to, quote, resolve the crisis politically. Well, we got to quibble about what politically means and how we get there. There can be no peace at the expense of territorial compromises, Zelensky added. The territorial integrity of Ukraine must be restored within the 1991 borders. Zelensky's not going to compromise on that particular point, and he shouldn't. Okay, here's another article talking in Radio Free Europe about Russia's response to that. The Kremlin said on the 27th that it welcomed anything that could bring an end to the Ukraine conflict. But Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said Russia still needed to achieve the aims of what it called the special military operation. Okay, well, if that's the case, they're just simply not serious about actually ending the war, and they're not. Another article in Radio Free Europe talking about the meeting. Xi's call with Zelensky sets the stage for greater Chinese diplomatic push in Europe. Xi offered to help facilitate peace talks, saying that Beijing will neither watch the fire from the other side nor add fuel to the fire, let alone take advantage of the crisis to profit. Now, I thought that last little bit was really interesting. Like they're saying we're not going to try to use this for our own profit, but of course they are positioning themselves to profit or benefit in some way, one way or another. But it was interesting that they added that. There was a nearly 1 hour conversation, which I thought that's pretty remarkable. That's a long time. What did they talk about? The call was widely viewed as an attempt by China to repair its strained ties with the European Union as the bloc formulates a new policy toward China ahead of the June summit, and comes amid a broader Chinese effort to alleviate European concerns over its position in the war. Aha. Okay. So there's a June summit with the EU. China wants to be a good team player and look like it's cooperating in order to, because remember, China wants to continue to trade. They don't want to get embroiled in a war, not unless they absolutely have to or they get Taiwan. So, okay, one more article, and this is now from China Daily, which is a state-owned paper that tends to be a little bit more liberal than the Chinese line, but it's still state-owned. Chinese President Xi on Wednesday held phone talks with his Ukrainian counterpart. During their conversation, Xi reiterated China's core position on promoting peace talks between Ukraine and Russia. The phone call provides further illustration of China's willingness to mediate. But remember, in February, the Chinese Foreign Ministry released a paper stating Beijing's position on Ukrainian crisis, putting forward a 12-point proposal. But that 12-point proposal didn't say, like, restore the integrity of Ukraine or anything like that. It was a little tepid. China and Russia, now this is interesting, just listen to the language. China and Russia have blazed a path of major country relations featuring strategic trust and good neighborliness. Meanwhile, China-Ukraine relations have gone through 31 years of development and reached a level of strategic partnership. Like, they just are kind of wanting to play nice with everyone, and there's a reason for it. Now, here's what I find really interesting. There's essentially 10 different ways that Xi could play this. There could be more, and I'm not a China expert, so I'm not claiming that I am. So the first one is that China tries to take Taiwan. If China tries to take Taiwan, it kicks off probably World War III. The U.S. has already claimed they will defend Taiwan. Japanese, Koreans, they don't want that. There's multiple parties, and you have a big problem. Now, I don't think that that's terribly likely, and I don't think it's likely largely because of what Xi witnessed about how the world coalesced around Ukraine. So I think that one is less likely than maybe something else. Now, there's another really interesting possibility here, and Jake Bro talked about this on his show yesterday. Okay, so Jake Bro had a really interesting take about this. The context here is that he is he's listening to Russian state media that's talking about China potentially wanting to take back land, historic Chinese land, from Russia. So here's what he had to say.
Like him, he's a worm. His name is Mardan. He has his own show, and he said the thing that I didn't think the Russians would ever bring up. So let me read for you what he says. It would be better for our interest if China kept harping on its song about the United Nations and international law. Right now, China's official position is that the territorial sovereignty of all countries should be respected. Russia actually wants China to keep saying this. Because if China starts seriously mentioning some historic rights on the regular basis, then you can imagine that once again, we'll have to unfold the 1.5 million man army in the Far East like it was in the 1970s. There is a simple reason for that. Look at the short historic review on how Russia increased its lands in the Amur region. Read how the Far East ended up to be parts of the Russian Empire. And here's the problem between Russia and China. So here is a map of the Qing dynasty in the year 1820. This was right before China's century of humiliation, in which Western colonial powers carved up their spheres of influence. So the Germans, the French, the British, the Portuguese, the Japanese, and from the north, the Russians. The Russians invaded China and stole Outer Manchuria. They took this territory from the Qing dynasty. By 1950, China had reclaimed all of their territory from colonial powers, all their territory except Outer Manchuria from the Russians. When the Russians talk about restoring and respecting historical borders, they don't really want to apply this to China's claim to Outer Manchuria.
Oopsie.
And I don't think this is unrelated, but the last couple years, China's been building hundreds of hardened intercontinental ballistic missile silos in the West.
Now, I didn't know anything about that, but Jake is a former missileer, so I'm going to lean on him and his understanding here.
Now, there are three nations in the world that have a land-based nuclear deterrent. This is the United States, Russia, and now China. But if Russia and China are military allies, and Russia can provide a land-based nuclear deterrent from the United States, why does China need them? Why does China, in the near term, feel it necessary to be constructing hundreds of these missile silos? And I don't think the United States is ever going to launch a full-scale nuclear attack against China. What I think China wants is a nuclear deterrent from the Russians should they try to retake Outer Manchuria.
And the Russians have kind of proven themselves that they're willing to do those kinds of things.
So where I'm going with this is if Russia continues to decline, if their military continues to weaken, I don't think China will hesitate to go into Outer Manchuria and reclaim this territory.
Now, Jake may know something that I don't know. I don't see this as probable, but he may be right. I'm not an expert on this, and I don't know, but let's hear what he has to say.
And they want hundreds of hardened missile silos as a deterrent from the Russians.
And the idea of a deterrent against the Russians makes amazing sense to my mind.
Sure, Russia might nuke a Chinese city, kill 1 million of their citizens. I don't think President Xi really cares. He's got a population of 1.3 billion people. China would not hesitate to retaliate with their own nuclear forces. I'm being serious. I think the most likely scenario leading to nuclear war in the next 5 years is not the United States or NATO going to nuclear war with someone. It's between two fascist dictators like Putin and President Xi.
And he might be on to something. I know that there's some bad blood between China and Russia. Sometimes we can't see it. We just think, oh, they're communist, and or they have been communist, and they're all monolithic. No group is monolithic, and they don't like each other. And if you get down to it, they don't trust each other, but they kind of work together, but they really don't trust each other at the end of the day. So perhaps he's on to something.
This is pretty dark stuff. Let's go on Google Earth and just look at this border. This white line is the border between China and Russia. I've talked about this in previous videos. There's a million good reasons why China wants Outer Manchuria back. But the primary one has to be access to the Pacific Ocean. The way that China's border stands now, they can only access the Pacific Ocean by going through the first island chain. This is Japan, Okinawa, South Korea, Taiwan, and the Philippines. All strategic allies of the United States. Mm-hmm. But if they got the Pacific coastline back from Outer Manchuria, if they got the Sakhalin Islands, then they could sail in and out of the Pacific Ocean more easily, evading U.S. aircraft carriers. In addition, the Sakhalin Islands have untapped oil and gas reserves. Russia's too slow and incompetent to tap these resources. I also just want to zoom in on the map here and show you the stark difference between the Chinese side of the border. Every square inch of land is developed and being cultivated, used to increase China's GDP. But when you cross the border into Russia, this is the exact same climate, exact same topography. It's barely being used at all. Russia cannot find citizens willing to move out here and live on the Chinese border. So I'm sure China every day just looks at this and says, well, let's just wait for Russia to get a little bit weaker.
Could be. Now, that's a very interesting take that Jake brings forward. I don't know how accurate, or accurate's not the right word, how likely something like that could be, but this isn't my field of strength. Is it in the realm of the possible? Yes, I don't know that it's terribly likely, but I don't want to rule it out because of that. Now, I also wonder if it came to pass, how it would play out if China invaded Russia. And this is kind of like Westerners dreaming, probably more than reality. But let's say if China invaded Russia and tried to take back their land, the Russians would go absolutely nuts. And you can't take our land, and right? And what would be the response of the Western world? What would be the response of, say, NATO and Western allies who would be looking at this going, well, we're kind of busy over here in Ukraine, so, or would they not want China in a balance of power kind of way to be able to take that? I don't know. So I leave that in place as one of the things that President Xi may do, only because it's possible. I don't think it's terribly likely, but it's possible. Okay, the next one is far more likely, but it's become more improbable since the leak. And so the next one is that China militarily supports Russia. And it looks like they were thinking about doing it and even thinking about how to cover it up and, do it surreptitiously, but they didn't do it to our knowledge, or at least to whatever leaked Pentagon papers were. There was some looked like they were going to do it, but they didn't do it. Okay, the next possibility is that China supports Russia with humanitarian aid. This seems pretty likely. So China supporting Russia, they have a long history together, although Russia seems far more interested in a multipolar balancing of the US with the BRICS than China does. China just wants to trade with everyone. Yes, they want to be dominant. Yes, they would like to do that, but they don't want to do it by paying the hard way, and Russia seems to be willing to pay the hard way. So the next approach is that China and Russia reverse historic positions. I've said that I see this happening to some degree. For a long time, it was like Russia's the big brother and China's the little brother. And as the war goes on, Russia has degraded itself and degraded itself and degraded itself to the point where it seems like China's going to become the dominant player in the region, and Russia is going to be, well, like what North Korea is to Russia. And it seems like they're degrading and degrading, and China is just benefiting from that all the way around. But I think they'll replace and switch their dominant historical positions. Another potential position is that China will assert neutrality, just become Switzerland and say, look, I want to work with you, I want to work with them. I'm not going to do anything to harm either one of you. That could be, and they seem to be indicating that in these recent articles, the phone call, the attempt at, but I don't really see it. I mean, so China is an authoritarian state. Jake Bro just talked about that. Authoritarian states tend to be chummy with each other. Sometimes they go to war with each other, but they don't tend to like democracies inherently. For some reason, they can't seem to work together. And so I don't see a natural fit between the two, but there is one reason that would cause that, and that's the New Silk Road. So this is the World Economic Forum, and here is a map of the New Silk Road. So you'll notice that the New Silk Road is going all over the place, and it's a trade route between China and the rest of the world. But what you'll notice here is that this road goes right through Ukraine, right past Kyiv on the way to Moscow. So they want to trade with Moscow, but they also want to trade with Ukraine along the way. And then they want to trade with Europe, and they want to trade with Africa, and they want to have this well developed. So I think this is where China really leans. They don't want to be militant and combative, except perhaps where it comes to Taiwan. So President Xi's position may come down to something as simple as, show me the money. And that's actually a good thing for world peace and stability as we move forward. So another approach is that China might try to mediate peace. I'm not sure that they are going to be seen as an honest broker, but they may move toward that over time. Right now, that would be kind of like France trying to be an honest broker between Russia and Ukraine, where France has really leaned in on the Ukrainian side. China is perceived as having leaned in on the Russian side, so it might not work, but it might, and they might move that direction. I don't think that that's what's going to happen, but perhaps it could. Another alternative is that China might decide that it wants to become the leader of the multipolar BRICS. Now, BRICS stands for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And they're thinking about including some other countries, Iran and a few others, into their arrangement. And they actually have a larger GDP than the G7 or Western countries that they're competing with. They can create their own trading bloc, but if you're China, do you really want to just be with the BRICS, or do you want to trade with everyone? They want to trade with the BRICS, they want to trade with the West, and I think that trade is what's really kept them from leaning in with Russia. So another opportunity for Xi would be to get cozy with the West, and it looks like he's moving toward trying to repair relations with the West, but I don't think he wants to shed the BRICS either. The BRICS are less developed than Western powers, but he wants to be able to trade with all. So that's possible, but I don't know that that's likely. And then finally, China could turn its back on Russia, which would be a very strange thing given their history. Now, there's some bad blood between China and Russia. While they're kind of allies, they're kind of antagonists. It's not like the US and Canada that pretty well get along. They actually kind of don't trust each other, although they try to work together. And my guess is between all these things on the scale, China is going to do everything it can to drain the resources and get the best deal that it can from Russia without committing itself to Russia, and trying to position itself so that it can profit from whatever happens one way or another. Okay, so those are 10 potential positions for Xi. I'm going to close with this last little video from France 24 because I think it was insightful. So here we go.
It is important to contextualize this conversation. It comes 1 month after President Xi visited Moscow, 2 months since the 12-point position paper published by Beijing, and 14 months after the Russian invasion. You'll also note that on the Chinese side, they call it the Ukrainian crisis and not the Ukrainian war, and not Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
So that's really interesting, how the language that they use, and I think that that's telling of where Xi may actually land on the scale.
Beijing is clearly not a neutral player in all of this, but it still wants to be a global peacemaker. The official line is all about how much China is a respectful UN Security Council sitting country, a responsible major state, and it does everything it does, I quote, is above board. So far, there's been a lot of skepticism from Kyiv and some of its allies, and no doubt last week's gaffe from a sitting Chinese ambassador, it didn't help. He questioned the sovereignty of post-Soviet states. So we'll have to wait and see if the new envoys can achieve something concrete, or if once again this is all talk and no concrete action.
So I hope that helps you understand what's going on with President Xi in his relation to the Ukraine. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the super thanks. Thank you for the coffees. Thank you for donating to charities, caring enough to watch these videos. If you're still watching this right now, you really care about Ukraine. And thank you for being the kind of person that cares about Ukraine.